be moved. Abortion is a woman's right. We shall not be moved, just like a tree that's standing by the water. We shall not be moved.
Defend Dr. Edelin.
We shall not be moved. Defend Dr. Edelin. We shall not be moved, just like a tree that's standing by the water. We shall not be moved.
Good evening. Those demonstrations took place a year ago in Boston, Massachusetts, at the trial of a young American doctor, Kenneth Edelin. In 1973, he had performed an abortion on a 17-year-old unmarried black girl. The abortion was perfectly legal. The Supreme Court had just ruled that abortions could not be prohibited before viability, 24 to 28 weeks. And so instead, Edelin was charged with manslaughter of the fetus. Many people saw the trial as an attempt by anti-abortionists to challenge the Supreme Court decision, and it became one of the most controversial trials in American history. Kenneth Edelin, a Negro despite his pale appearance, was chief resident at Boston City Hospital. It was a poorly funded hospital in the heart of the black ghetto. Here, among the poor and ill-educated, the social need for abortion was greatest. His defense counsel was William Homans, Jr., respected, courteous, with a reputation for defending unpopular causes. Against them was Assistant District Attorney Newman Flanagan, called Newman after the Catholic convert Cardinal Newman, tough, witty, flamboyant, father of 7 children, and Flanagan was known to be a formidable opponent in court. Since Edelin was accused of manslaughter, Flanagan had to prove that the fetus was a person. There was much expert testimony, and the jury wrestled with some of the most delicate and complex questions of medicine and law. At what instant is a baby born? When does a fetus become viable, capable of living apart from its mother? When does it become a person? What follows is a reconstruction of the trial with actors based on the official court transcripts. The context is American, but the issues raised go right to the heart of the continuing abortion debate here in Britain.
Shall I read the indictment, Your Honor?
Yes, read it.
Members of the jury, hearken to the indictment. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts, at the Superior Court, holding at the City of Boston and for the County of Suffolk, presents that Kenneth Edelin, on the 3rd day of October, in the year of our Lord, 1973, did assault and beat a certain person, to wit, a male child described as baby boy, and by such assault and beating did kill said person, a true bill. To this indictment, the defendant pleads not guilty, and for trial places himself upon the country, which country you are. Members of the jury, hearken to your evidence.
Mr. Flanagan, you may proceed.
May it please the court. Mr. Foreman, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there will be evidence that in the latter part of September 1973, a woman approximately 17 years old was admitted to Boston City Hospital for the purposes of terminating a pregnancy. The record will indicate that on the 2nd and 3rd of October, the defendant and another doctor attempted to perform a saline infusion. That's a process by which they endeavor to kill the fetus while it is in the mother, and they were unsuccessful. There'll be evidence that at that time, the defendant, Kenneth Edelin, performed a hysterotomy, and that once he opened the womb of the mother, he detached the placenta. That's where the child gets his nourishment while it's in the mother. There will be evidence and testimony that when they commenced the hysterotomy, that baby was alive, that when the placenta was detached, the child was alive, and the cause of death was anoxia, or suffocation. Now, there'll be a lot of testimony about the word viability. The Commonwealth represents that this male child could have lived and would have lived, but for the act of this defendant. And there'll be a lot of talk about abortion in this case. The Commonwealth respectfully submits that the issue here is the unlawful killing of a male child, not abortion, but a criminal manslaughter. Thank you.
Mr. Homans?
Mr. Foreman, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will hear that Kenneth Edelin, a well-thought-of physician, was, at the time of the operation in question, chief resident in obstetrics and gynecology at Boston City Hospital. and that as such, he and other members of the staff, in accordance with the policies of the hospital, at times performed abortions. That is, terminations of pregnancies of women who came to the hospital seeking to have their pregnancies terminated. You will hear from witnesses on both sides, I am sure, that abortion contemplates the destruction or termination of whatever life inheres in the fetus. You will hear that hysterotomy is a recognized form of abortion, and that the manner in which Dr. Edelin performed the hysterotomy was in accordance with sound medical practice. You will hear evidence that this fetus never drew a single breath outside the body of the mother. Most important, perhaps, you will hear evidence as to the meaning of words like anoxia and hypoxia, suffocation, and whether they apply to what was involved here. We will show that although the indictment refers to the killing of a baby boy, that in fact no baby boy ever existed, and certainly no baby boy was ever killed. We ask you to consider whether Dr. Edelin committed manslaughter or whether he performed a correct, proper, lawful abortion in accordance with universally accepted medical standards. We ask you to listen to all of the evidence.
Mr. Flanagan, you may proceed.
The Commonwealth calls Dr. Enrique Jimenez, Your Honor. Now, Dr. Jimenez, do you know the defendant in this case, Dr. Edelin?
Sure. Since I started my residency. He was 1 year ahead of me.
And do you recall examining the patient in this case on September 30th, 1973?
Yes, sir. I did a pelvic and abdominal examination. It was my impression she had a pregnancy of 24 weeks.
And how did you determine that, Doctor?
The fundus of the uterus was 4 finger breadths above the umbilical scar. And this is consistent with at least 24 weeks.
And did you obtain a fetal heartbeat at that time, Doctor?
Yes. The heart rate was 140.
All right. Now, when was the next time that you saw that particular patient?
In the operating room.
All right. And what was the first thing that you observed when you got in there?
I observed a surgeon cutting through the abdomen and into the lower portion of the uterus.
All right. And what next took place?
Well, as soon as he went into the uterine cavity, he introduced his hand and made a motion with his hand around the uterine cavity, this motion, and with force, which is a motion I have often used to detach the placenta.
Well, now, Doctor, do you have an opinion as to what is in the mother after the placenta has been detached?
Live birth. It's a baby boy or a baby girl.
I object, Your Honor, and ask that the answer be stricken.
Is that the term you use regularly in your medical practice?
Yes.
I will allow it to stand.
Please note my exception, Your Honor.
All right. Now, after Dr. Edelin detached the placenta, Doctor, what next did he do?
He left his hand inside the uterus and looked at the clock in the operating room.
And how long did he look at the clock, Doctor?
At least 3 minutes.
And during this 3-minute period, were you observing Dr. Edelin?
Yes.
And what, if anything, did you observe him doing?
He was looking at the clock. Nothing else. He was still looking at the clock.
Well, Doctor, assume that this live baby, which is in the uterus of the mother, remains in there for at least 3 minutes after the placenta has been detached. What will happen to the baby?
The baby would die. He's not able to sustain life inside the uterus on its own system. He will die unless he is delivered outside.
And how long does he sustain life, if you know?
I couldn't tell you how long. It has to be at least a few seconds. Because the baby is alive inside of the uterus. And the baby, before he dies, he takes vigorous gasps to try to get some air. And this takes at least a few seconds.
And do you have an opinion as to what would cause the death?
Anoxia, lack of oxygen.
All right. Now, Doctor, after this period, which you've stated was at least 3 minutes, what next did the defendant do?
He removed the baby and the placenta from the uterus.
Mm-hmm. And, Doctor, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the baby was alive at that time?
I object to the use of the word baby, Your Honor.
Did you observe any life signs?
No, the baby was dead.
Doctor, after you observed what took place, what next did you do?
I didn't do anything. I left the room.
Are you an abortionist, Doctor?
I object, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Do you perform abortions, Doctor?
No.
Thank you. Your witness.
Now, as I recall, you said the procedure was done in the first operating room.
That's the best I can recall. It could have been the other one. I don't remember. I don't know.
You aren't sure.
I don't know. But to the best of my recollection, it was the first.
Having in mind your testimony that you were in the first operating room, do you now, sir, wish to modify that statement?
Yes. I'm not sure.
Now, will you kindly tell us the position of this clock in whatever operating room you were in, sir?
I don't know the exact particular place on the wall. I know there was a clock there.
All right. I show you this photograph, sir. Do you recognize the clocks in that operating room, sir?
I see two clocks here. Do you mean this was the clock?
I don't know, sir. I am asking you.
I don't know. It looks like any operating room. I know there was a clock there. I don't remember that there were two.
Your statement is that there was only one clock?
No, my statement is I don't remember.
All right. Now, you have gone into some detail about Dr. Edelin's hand, that he permitted his hand to remain in the uterus of the patient. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you said that he permitted his hand to remain inside there for at least 3 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did you time that period of 3 minutes on one of the clocks on one of the walls in one of the operating rooms?
Yes. I was looking, along with everybody in the room, at the clock.
Is there anyone among the several persons who was not looking at the clock?
It could have been. How do I know? I remember the group, as a group, was looking at the clock.
Do you know how Dr. Edelin stood or what he did with his body while he was looking at the clock, sir?
His body was still.
He was looking straight ahead, was he?
I'm not sure.
Well, may I ask you whether he was looking to the right, sir, or to the left?
I'm not sure.
Was he turning around looking behind him?
I'm not sure.
Wouldn't you have found it worthy of note and worthy of recollection if Dr. Edelin had turned around behind him like that while he had his hand in the uterus like that?
It is my recollection, certainly, that he looked at the clock while he was still.
Now, sir, an incision into the uterus without question produces bleeding, does it not?
Yes.
Do you, sir, regard a wait of 3 minutes without the surgeon doing anything to stop the bleeding as an unusual time to wait, sir?
Yes.
Did you notice any excessive bleeding as a result of what you say happened?
No, there was average bleeding.
I have no further questions of the witness.
Jimenez was the only prosecution witness who had seen the abortion. His testimony would be challenged later by Edelin and the other medical staff who were present. And there were rumors about Jimenez himself. Outside the court, newspapers carried reports that he'd been in trouble at the hospital, that he'd been on bad terms with his superior there, Kenneth Edelin. But now Flanagan began to call his expert witnesses. Predictably, perhaps, many were deeply involved in the anti-abortion movement. Throughout, Flanagan pushed the same questions. Was the fetus viable? Did it live as an independent being outside the mother?
Now, Dr. Vernick, where are you employed?
I am the director of the newborn services at the St. Paul, Minnesota Ramsey Hospital. I deal with high-risk babies.
And now, Doctor, in your duties at the hospital, have you treated subjects that are under 24 weeks of age?
Yes, sir.
And when I say treated subjects, I'm talking of live subjects?
Yes, sir.
Right now, Doctor, what is viability?
It's a vast Pandora's box because many people have their own definition of viability. As I understand it from current medical thinking, viability is the ability of the baby or subject to exist outside of the uterus.
And is there any length of time involved?
This is where there's this disagreement among medical circles. My own feeling is that there should be no time limit on viability as far as the ability to live outside of the uterus.
I move that the answer be stricken, Your Honor, as not representing accepted medical opinions.
I will strike it. The witness said that there was a dispute, as I understand it,
Yes, could I clarify that, Your Honor?
in generally accepted medical terminology.
First of all, babies can exist outside of the uterus for a very little period of time, even as early as, for instance, 12 weeks gestation. They may die within 3 minutes or live longer. It's a question of length, and people don't agree on how long that should be. Do you mean 1 day? Do you mean 30 days? Is he going to grow up to be an adult? As far as prolonged survival outside of the uterus, there have been documented cases under
I
24...
think the witness has gone beyond the scope of the question.
He has answered the question.
Doctor, is there a generally accepted definition in the medical profession of the word viability?
No.
Thank you, Doctor. Your witness.
Are you able, sir, to give us the statistical probability as to a baby of 800 grams or less dying, sir?
At what gestation?
Or let's say 24 weeks gestational age, sir?
A baby of 24 weeks gestational age weighing 800 grams has a chance for survival, a very definite chance.
Your specialty is neonatology. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, it is.
As I understand it, neonatology deals with the first 28 days of postnatal life.
Yes.
And how many babies under 800 grams have you treated for that 28-day period, sir?
It would have to be a real ballpark figure, but I'd say 10 or 15.
Well, now, of those 10 or 15, could you tell us how many you treated through the 28th day?
I can't recall how many survived through the 28th day.
As a matter of fact, you can't recall that any survived through the 28th day.
I will object.
I will allow it. Can you?
No, sir.
Now, sir, your definition of viable is the capacity to survive even for a second after birth. Is that not true, sir?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Now, where are you employed, Dr. Curtis?
I am the medical examiner of Suffolk County.
And on February 12th, 1974, Doctor, did you perform an autopsy on this subject?
I did.
Now, Doctor, I show you 2 photographs. Are these photographs fair representations of the subject as he appeared on February 12th, 1974?
They are.
I now offer the photographs.
I object, Your Honor.
I will see counsel.
Your Honor, these photographs show a picture of the deceased taken on February 7th or thereabouts prior to the autopsy on February 12th, 1974. The Commonwealth hopes to introduce evidence that these were fair representation of the deceased as he appeared on October 3rd, 1973, except for the shrinkage of skin. I think this evidence is very, very material to the issue of whether there ever was a baby boy alive or dead.
Your Honor, the Commonwealth can prove or not prove whether this fetus was born alive. Certainly, these photographs add nothing to this issue. None of us is exposed on a day-to-day basis, or for that matter, even one day in our life to material like this. We therefore suggest that the impact of these photographs on this jury is so inflammatory as to require you to exclude them as having no probative value, and I therefore oppose their introduction.
I will admit one picture. I will not admit both because one is simply an enlargement of the other.
My exception, Your Honor. May I make one more request? I would hope that only the members of the jury and those people who are involved in this case will be able to see this.
I will take extra care.
Mr. Foreman, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Exhibit 9 has been introduced in evidence and will be shown to you. Pictures which are unpleasant or even gruesome have been deemed to be admissible. You must not view this in fairness to the defendant from any emotional point of view. Nor is this picture intended, nor could it properly be introduced for any inflammatory reasons. You are to view it solely to determine whether it offers any assistance or whether it has any evidential value on a material issue in this case. You may proceed, Mr. Flanagan.
Now, Doctor, what did your external examination and autopsy reveal?
It revealed the body to be that of a well-developed, well-nourished black male fetus in the fetal position, measuring crown to heel 13 inches and weighing 700 grams or 1.54 pounds.
Now, Doctor, at some time, did you do a microscopic examination of any of the parts of this particular subject?
I did, of the lungs.
And tell us what that revealed, if anything.
Well, the alveoli, or the air sacs of the lung, they were collapsed for the most part. There were some partially collapsed and some expanded. Most were empty. A few contained red blood cells.
Now, you said some partially collapsed and some expanded. Could you tell us what, if anything, that indicates?
Well, the expansion indicates that there was respiratory activity.
And, Doctor, are the findings that you have made concerning the lungs of this subject consistent with breathing outside of the mother?
Yes, I feel there was respiratory activity, at least gasping for breath.
And what was your opinion as to the gestational age, Doctor?
23, 24 weeks.
Your witness.
Doctor, are you aware of a phenomenon known as fetal respiration, intrauterine fetal respiration, sir?
Yes, I'm familiar with it.
And does the phenomenon of fetal respiration involve respiratory activity in the lung while the fetus is inside the uterus?
I object to the word phenomenon. I think life itself is a phenomenon.
I will withdraw the word phenomenon. I'm trying to look for a better word, Your Honor.
All right.
The miracle.
I object and ask that my brother's speech be stricken.
Strike the miracle.
Now, Dr. Curtis, does fetal respiration involve the inhalation and exhalation of amniotic fluid as a result of the actions of the lungs of the fetus inside the uterus?
Yes.
And the result of this process may be to cause some distension or enlargement of the alveoli or air sacs. Is that correct?
I would object, Your Honor.
I will allow it.
This is correct.
So that the distension of the alveoli of the lungs in this fetus, which you observed under the microscope, could have resulted from this inspiration of amniotic fluid just as probably as it could have resulted from, as you put it, a gasp, sir?
That is correct.
Yes, sir. Now, sir, you don't belong to any Doctors for Life or Right to Life organization, do you?
No, I do not.
You call them as you see them, don't you, Doctor?
That is correct.
Wait a minute. I would object. I would hope that every witness would call them as they see them. I move that that statement be stricken.
It is stricken.
I have nothing further, sir.
Homans had wrung from Curtis a major concession. As official medical examiner, he was the only witness to actually examine the fetus. He admitted to a reasonable doubt whether or not it had breathed outside the mother. To try to remove that doubt, Flanagan called his next witness, Dr. John Ward.
Now, you were a doctor in pathology, Dr. Ward?
Yes, sir. I am presently associate pathologist at Mercy Hospital in Pittsburgh.
And at some time, did you receive a copy of the autopsy report in this particular matter?
Yes.
Your Honor, we would stipulate that these are slides of the lungs of the subject that Dr. Curtis had taken. Now, Dr. Ward, did you do an examination on these particular slides?
Yes.
And what did that examination reveal as to the condition of the lungs?
Generally, they were the lungs of a premature infant or fetus.
And do you have an opinion based upon reasonable medical certainty as to whether or not the particular subject breathed outside of the uterus?
Yes. I believe that the subject did breathe outside the uterus.
And what do you base that opinion on, Doctor?
Solely on the microscopic appearance of the lungs, which showed that the air spaces in the lungs were not uniformly dilated and filled with fluid. If a baby has not breathed, the air spaces are uniformly filled with fluid. If it has breathed, there are evidences of collapse in the lungs.
And in these particular lungs, what did you find, Doctor?
I believe, due to the fact that the lungs were described as being partially collapsed and partially dilated, that the fluid, which is normally present in a lung before a baby breathes, was displaced by air. And the collapse took place due to the absorption of air, and that this baby died from hypoxia, or lack of oxygen, due to the separation of the placenta.
Thank you, Doctor. Your witness.
Sir, have you conducted studies or done experiments concerning the effect of rhythmic movement of the lungs in utero or fetal respiratory activity?
No, sir, I have not.
Now, sir, if another witness in this case who had examined the fetus testified that it was as probable that the distension in the alveoli was as a result of the inspiration of amniotic fluid, as it was probable that they were distended as the result of a gasp outside the uterus, you would agree with him, would you not, sir?
No, sir, I would not.
Do you agree that intrauterine respiration involves sucking in of amniotic fluid into the lungs of a fetus, say, from 22 weeks on?
Well, this is controversial. Some authorities, such as Dr. Potter, say that this takes place. Some say, Dr. Dawes, that it doesn't take place, unless the fetus has been distressed.
Now, sir, if Dr. Dawes had changed his mind, would you change yours, sir?
I'm going to object.
Wait a moment, I'll sustain the objection.
In any event, Dr. Ward, you have relied on Dawes. Is that correct, sir?
I rely in the sense that I respect his opinion, but I still have to make my own individual judgments. I have to be eclectic.
Having in mind your eclecticism, I show you this, sir, and it is entitled Fetal Respiratory Movements Discovered by G.S. Dawes.
I object, Your Honor.
He may show him the text.
And referring specifically to page 870, I ask you to read this paragraph, sir, and this paragraph. Would you agree now, sir, that in fact respiratory activity takes place during portions of the fetal existence other than merely at times of fetal distress or physical stimuli, sir?
Relying on what I have read, I conclude this is a distinct possibility, yes, sir.
Relying on what you have read when, sir?
Right in front of me at the moment is Dawes' text.
Well, you are in opposition, are you not, sir, to the opportunity for abortion permitted by the Supreme Court decision in the Roe against Wade, are you not, sir?
Yes, sir.
I think I have no further questions.
Doctor, you are excused. Do not discuss your testimony in this case with anybody during the trial.
Your Honor, the Commonwealth rests its case in chief.
By now, interest in the trial had spread. It was no longer just a colorful local drama. All over America, pro- and anti-abortion groups watched with growing concern. From the start, there had been suspicion about the motives for prosecuting Edelin. It was election year for the district attorney. It was his decision to spend $1 million on this trial. Hundreds of doctors were performing legal abortions protected by the Supreme Court's ruling. If that was to be challenged, predominantly Catholic Boston would be a favorable setting for a test case. But why was Edelin chosen? The teenage black mother, whose identity was kept secret, must have been typical of the cases Edelin had to deal with. Working in the poorest part of Boston, he performed legal abortions from a sense of public duty. He was also the only black man to be a hospital chief resident. The trial lasted 6 weeks. On the 19th day, Edelin himself took the stand.
Could you tell us, Dr. Edelin, something of your background and training?
I was graduated from medical school in 1967. I interned in the Air Force and was assigned for 3 years to England. Was discharged in 1971 when I came to Boston City Hospital to begin my residency in obstetrics and gynecology.
When was the first time that you had any contact with the patient in this case?
Well, a few days before she was admitted, I was introduced to her and her mother in the outpatient clinic so that they would know who I was when she was admitted to the hospital. Then on the morning of October the 2nd, in the saline unit, when I examined her abdomen and estimated the gestational age of pregnancy.
And what did you find then?
I felt in the abdomen the outline of the uterus, and I found that the fundus, or the top of the uterus, was no more than a finger's breadth above the umbilicus, which indicated to me that she was 20 to 22 weeks pregnant.
Now, sir, I show you this photograph. Can you tell us what this is, sir?
That's operating room 2 at Boston City Hospital in the gynecology department.
Is there anything in this picture that does not appear the same as it was on October 3rd, 1973, to the best of your recollection, sir?
Well, the clocks. I think they were broken and out for repairs.
Now, what happened first in that operating room on October 3rd, 1973, sir?
Dr. Penza was there to attempt the saline infusion. He also obtained blood, and so we confirmed our decision to go ahead with the hysterotomy. I instructed the operating room personnel, and I went out to get an assistant and to scrub up for the surgery.
And what did you do then, sir?
I made a low transverse incision into the uterus. I didn't want to cut up higher where I presumed the placenta was or where the previous saline attempts had been made. There's always a possibility of infection where the needle enters the uterus. And I thought that the scar from this kind of incision would be a bit safer for the patient in future pregnancies.
And what did you do next, sir?
I inserted 2 fingers into the incision and tried to sweep around to separate the placenta and the amniotic sac from the uterus. And then I tried to ease everything out intact through the incision. But unfortunately, the sac broke.
And what did you do when the amniotic sac ruptured?
I tried to extract the fetus, but I had some difficulty because of that thick muscle and because the incision was small.
And what did you do once you had succeeded in extracting the fetus?
I observed it, and in the process of passing it to the stainless steel basin which my scrub tech was holding, I checked it for heartbeat by touching the anterior chest wall.
You were looking for a sign of life, is that correct, sir?
Yes, sir.
And how long did it take from the incision into the uterus to the moment you passed the fetus to the scrub tech?
Probably took a couple of minutes.
Was there any time, sir, when you looked at the clock in the operating room while holding your fingers in the uterus for a prolonged period of time?
Absolutely not.
Now, assuming that you may be mistaken as to whether or not a clock was there, if you had looked at the clock, where would you be facing with respect to the patient for 3 minutes or more?
Well, I would have had to turn my entire body around. The area where the clocks are would be behind me.
Did you remain motionless with your fingers in the uterus of the patient for 3 minutes or any significant period of time, sir?
No, sir.
Now, sir, at that time, had a policy been established at Boston City Hospital with respect to abortions for measures to be taken if a live fetus were delivered?
Yes, sir.
Who would establish that?
As chief resident, I would.
And what was that policy, sir?
That if a live fetus were delivered, it would be taken immediately to the newborn nursery to be cared for by a pediatrician.
Now, Dr. Edelin, prior to October 3rd, 1973, how many abortions by hysterotomy had you performed, sir?
10 or 12.
And during those hysterotomies, had you ever observed the delivery of a live fetus?
No, sir, never.
I ask you, Dr. Edelin, in connection with this surgical procedure, on October 3rd, 1973, whether you intended to or in fact did violate the law as you understood it, sir?
I did not.
I have no further questions.
All right. Now, doctor, what's your definition of abortion?
The interruption of pregnancy before the stage of viability.
All right, and the word viability has in it potential for life, is that correct?
Well, one assumes that in an abortion before the stage of viability, the fetus is going to succumb.
All right. Now, doctor, isn't it a fact that some subjects born at 38 weeks are not viable?
Are not capable of sustaining meaningful and prolonged life outside of the uterus. Yes, I suppose that's true.
So you don't limit viability to any specific age of the fetus, is that correct?
Well, I personally do, yes.
Oh, but that's your opinion?
That's the way I practice medicine, yes.
And at any time prior to the operation on the 3rd, did you determine whether or not the subject within the mother was alive?
Not that I recall.
Is that good medical practice, doctor?
Yes.
Well, couldn't you have found out whether that subject was alive or not?
I could have. But at this stage of this particular abortion, I didn't think that was necessary.
All right. But assume the fetus was dead. If you'd waited for a period of time after the saline, the fetus could have aborted itself. Isn't that correct?
That's a possibility.
And that would have prevented the entire operation, the hysterotomy. Isn't that correct?
If that had happened, but we had no way of knowing when that might happen.
Well, you have to wait, don't you, doctor?
That's correct, but sometimes it's detrimental to wait.
Would it have made any difference to you whether the subject was alive or dead?
No.
You would have performed the hysterotomy in any event?
Yes.
All right, let me ask you this, doctor. Assume the fetus was alive. Would you have a pediatrician in the operating room with you?
No.
Why not?
Because this was an abortion.
So what does that mean to you, doctor?
This was an abortion before the stage of viability. I thought it would be contrary to the mother's wishes and contrary to good medical practice.
That's what you thought?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, Doctor, you have testified that there is an advantage in detaching the placenta first when you enter the uterus of a woman 24 weeks pregnant?
So you can deliver everything intact and protect the patient from infection or bleeding.
Protect the patient? Well, do you agree that if the placenta is detached, the fetus is in trouble?
I object, Your Honor. That's argumentative.
Perhaps the word trouble is objectionable.
Well, do you agree that once the placenta is detached, the fetus has difficult problems?
I object again.
I will allow it.
My exception, Your Honor.
Once the placenta is detached, the supply of oxygen and nutrition to the fetus is cut off.
All right. And what happens to the fetus in that case, Doctor?
If the oxygen supply is cut off for a period of time, if the fetus has any potentiality for life, it will not have that any longer.
What period of time, Doctor?
Probably a couple of minutes.
Did you feel that you had any duty to that subject prior to the operation?
In some respects. If I had delivered a live-born fetus, I would have taken the necessary steps to see that it were taken to the nursery. That thought always goes through my mind.
Well, wouldn't it have been helpful to know what obligations you might have to that subject to know whether it was alive or dead before the operation began?
No. My obligation to the fetus could only begin after it was completely extracted from the uterus.
All right. Now, Doctor, you've testified that in a cesarean section, once you open the uterus, you lift the baby's head out?
Yes, after you rupture the membrane.
Right. What's a baby?
Well, baby is a kind of all-inclusive term.
Well, when you said baby, you meant baby, didn't you?
You were asking me about a cesarean section. I've never referred to the products of conception as a baby to a woman who's coming to me for an abortion. When I talk to a woman who wants to keep her pregnancy, then I talk about baby.
So it's just a difference in words, is that right, Doctor?
A difference in words and intent. When a woman talks to me about delivering her unborn child, she intends that I give both her and her unborn child the best possible care I can. A woman who comes to me for an abortion does not have that intent.
All right, but as a practical matter, Doctor, a lot of abortions end up with a live baby, don't they?
I don't know about a lot. I'm sure there's some.
All right. Now, Doctor, what did you do in this case after you removed the subject from the mother to determine whether it was alive or dead?
I observed it. I checked it for heartbeat and respiratory activity.
With rubber gloves?
Yes, sir.
For how long?
Well, after the fetus was completely extracted, I handled it, I guess, 3 to 5 seconds.
And between 3 and 5 seconds, you made a determination by placing your hand in a rubber glove over the chest. Is that correct?
And by observing it.
And you didn't tell us, Doctor, whether you determined whether the baby was alive or dead?
The fetus had no signs of life.
So that once you determined that there was no heartbeat in this 3 to 5 seconds, you did nothing further to determine whether the subject was alive or dead?
Other than observing it and checking it for respiratory movement and spontaneous movement? No.
Are there other means available?
Yes.
Did you do any of them?
No.
Thank you, Doctor.
You are excused.
The defendant calls Miss Ellen Curtis, Your Honor. Now, Miss Curtis, what were your duties at Boston City Hospital in October of 1973?
I was a circulating nurse in the operating room.
Can you tell us when you first saw the patient in this case?
The first time I saw her was the morning of October 3rd. I helped wheel her into the OR, too. We had the instrument set up for a saline infusion, and I explained to her what was going to happen, and just talked to her while the saline infusion proceeded.
And after the attempt at saline infusion, what did you observe?
Dr. Edelin proceeded with the hysterotomy of the patient. I saw the incision into the abdomen, and Dr. Edelin's fingers inside the incision.
And what happened with what Dr. Edelin was doing?
He spent a few more seconds, or maybe a minute or so, moving his fingers around. The next thing I saw was the fetus in his hand, and he was placing the fetus into a basin.
And what did you see Dr. Edelin doing insofar as looking at a clock during the operation?
He never looked at any clock. There was no clock on the wall in the operating room, too, at this time. It was missing until this past June.
Your witness.
Now, is it fair to say that you're a friend of Dr. Edelin's?
I work with him?
I didn't ask you that. Is it fair to say that you're a friend of Dr. Edelin's?
Yes, I am.
All right. Now, during the operation, what was the first thing that you observed Dr. Edelin doing after he made the incision?
He was moving his fingers around inside the abdomen.
All right, and how long did he move his fingers around?
Oh, I'd say for about a minute.
All right, and then what happened?
Then he asked me to get Dr. Charles.
How often is Dr. Charles called into the operating room in the middle of an operation?
I would say pretty frequently.
And where was Dr. Charles?
He was in the coffee room.
He was in the coffee room. Now, you don't know what the defendant did with his fingers while you were out getting Dr. Charles, did you?
No, I don't.
You didn't see him.
I wasn't gone for long.
I didn't ask you that.
No, I don't.
And when you went out and got Dr. Charles and came back, and his fingers were still in there, weren't they?
Yes.
All right, and when, then what happened after Dr. Charles left?
Dr. Edelin continued moving his fingers around, and then the fetus came out. Dr. Edelin placed the fetus in a basin, and the basin was passed to me by a scrub nurse.
And how long did it take Dr. Edelin to take the fetus in his hands and put it in the basin?
A couple of seconds.
That's all, Miss Curtis.
You may step down.
State your name, please, sir.
Kurt Benirschke,
Where do you live?
California, San Diego.
And what is your profession, sir?
I am a pathologist with my subspecialty in perinatal pathology. That is, the diseases of fetuses, infants, and the placenta.
Now, in 1974, sir, did you receive certain slides from Dr. Curtis?
Yes, I did.
And are these the slides here, sir?
Yes, these are the slides of the lungs of the fetus in question.
Could you tell us, sir, at what stage in the development can the lung of the fetus sustain extrauterine life for any period of time?
Generally at approximately 28 weeks, when proper alveoli are formed, which will serve as the future interchange between air and the blood circulating in the body. There cannot be adequate oxygen transfer through tissue which is not fully developed.
Now, do you have an opinion, sir, as to whether the fetus from which this lung or this portion of the lung was taken ever took a breath outside the uterus?
It is my opinion that this baby has not taken an extrauterine breath for the following reasons. There is now very good evidence that starting at 11 weeks of gestation, fluid is regularly exchanged from the amniotic sac into the future air spaces of the lung. Now, when respiration starts, air and fluid meet in the lung, and air bubbles are formed within the fluid. And there are no such air bubbles here.
And what indicated that there had been fluid, as you described it, in those spaces, sir?
Well, this fluid contains a small amount of protein. Protein, upon formalin fixation, is precipitated and then becomes stainable. This protein is found throughout the lung in all places.
In your opinion, was there any air inside this lung, sir?
I believe not.
Sir, based upon your examination of these slides, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the fetus here in question was live-born or stillborn?
In my opinion, it is stillborn.
I have no further questions.
What is your definition of viability, Doctor?
I would consider a two-pronged definition, a legal definition and a medical definition.
Well, you're here as a doctor. Let's have the medical definition, Doctor.
Medical definition. The ability to survive extrauterine life would be the definition of viability.
All right, Doctor. Now, do you agree, Doctor, that viability is a changing concept? Medical advances in the treatment of the premature make it possible to anticipate that even very small abortuses of 20 weeks gestation may soon have a greater chance of survival. One surely does not then wish to describe a surviving fetus as an abortus. Do you agree with that, Doctor?
That is, in general, a correct statement.
That's your statement, is it not, Doctor?
No, that is not my statement. That is Dr. Reed's statement.
Well, you co-authored that particular chapter, didn't you, Doctor?
That's correct.
All right. Now, Doctor, did you find any of the air spaces in these lungs expanded?
Expanded with something, yes.
And did you find some that were collapsed?
No.
Well, did you find some that were partially collapsed, Doctor?
All terminal air spaces were partially collapsed.
And some more than others, isn't that a fact?
The more peripheral ones were smaller and therefore appear more collapsed, but they are not.
Well, Doctor, the question was, some were more collapsed than others. Were they not?
No, sir.
No. Your answer is no. All right. Now, isn't it true, Doctor, that many babies, when they are born, are not breathing?
Many babies at term? It is true that some are, yes.
They have to be stimulated sometimes after birth, don't they, Doctor?
That's correct.
That's all, Doctor.
Defendant calls Dr. Jeffrey Gould, Your Honor. Have you, Dr. Gould, investigated some figures at my request?
Yes, some figures in a study I was conducting to determine the survival in the Boston City Hospital nursery of infants of various weights and ages.
Now, Dr. Gould, did you ascertain the survivor with the lowest weight in 1973?
Yes. One weighed 851 grams and lived 19 days.
In the year 1973, how many infants born weighing less than 999 grams left the hospital to go home?
I object.
Question of materiality?
Yes, Your Honor?
I'm going to allow it.
None left the hospital. Besides the one I mentioned before, they lived for between 15 minutes or so and 20 hours.
And did each of those infants have available to them the services of the newborn unit?
They did.
I have no further questions of this witness, Your Honor.
Now, Doctor, you're a pediatrician. When do you first make the determination of whether or not a child is viable?
At the first time of seeing the infant.
And you can tell me just looking at the child whether it's viable or not?
At what age range?
At the age range of 24 weeks gestation, 700 grams?
24 weeks and 700 grams. You could probably tell the child is going to be viable.
And, Doctor, when an infant is brought to you, you do all that you can for that infant. Isn't that correct?
All that is appropriate to do for the infant.
And who then makes the determination of whether the infant lives?
The determination, I think, is made by the infant, and the doctor helps.
So that the infant determines or decides whether or not he lives, is that correct?
Your Honor, may I clarify that, because it's a very important point.
You may answer each question as fully as you feel that the question needs to be answered.
All right. You have no trouble telling the extremely rare 700-gram infant that has a chance because you can see him gasping. You can see tone in his arms, and you can see that this infant is struggling for life. Now, on the other hand, there's a 700-gram infant who's live born because he has a heartbeat. Okay, that heartbeat may be 2 beats per minute. He has a breathing, and that breathing may be 1 gasp in the first 30 seconds. It's blue, has no tone. These don't survive, and they tell you this right from the beginning. Now, faced with an infant like this, you may perhaps try to stimulate, give a little oxygen, and look for a favorable response. If there is a favorable response, then even though the outlook is so incredibly bad, you may attach that infant to approximately $15,000 to $18,000 worth of equipment and try and try and try. But in general, results with infants of between 600 and 700 grams have been very, very disappointing. Only 1 in 250 even look as if they might possibly have a chance.
But you don't know who that one is, do you, Doctor?
At the time of birth, I think you have a pretty good idea who that one is.
But you're not there at the time of birth, Doctor. Were you there when Dr. Edelin performed the hysterotomy on October 3rd, 1973?
Pediatricians don't attend abortions.
Thank you, Doctor.
The defendant rests, Your Honor.
Very well. Mr. Homans, you may proceed.
Mr. Foreman, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not a case about a baby. This is a case about an abortion, about a physician performing a medical task, a case that affects not only Dr. Edelin, but thousands of other physicians. Now, what has been the Commonwealth's case here? The truth is, the case has been pushed and pushed hard. Consider Dr. Mecklenburg with his group campaigning against the present abortion law, and Mildred Jefferson. They both have an axe to grind. The same axe as Dr. Jimenez. Dr. Jimenez, who can't even recall what operating room he is in, puts himself facing the famous clocks or non-clocks and tells us that Dr. Edelin was standing there with his hand in the uterus of the patient for 3 minutes, and that every other person in the operating room was standing there looking at the clock with Dr. Edelin. Is this the kind of testimony you can accept? I would suggest that beyond a reasonable doubt you won't find that there was a clock even there. Then the Commonwealth apparently was concerned about the testimony of their witness, Dr. Curtis, who told you candidly that the respiratory activity in the lung of the fetus could have been intrauterine, just as likely as outside the patient, from the evidence he had. So they called in Dr. Ward from Pittsburgh to tell you how he interpreted the slides he had examined. Dr. Ward, who said in substance, well, Dr. Dawes has changed his mind. I guess I better change mine. What the Commonwealth is really saying is that if it hadn't been for the action of Dr. Edelin in performing what the Commonwealth has conceded was a lawful abortion, the 600-gram fetus would have survived. Remember the opinions of Dr. Benirschke and Dr. Driscoll that this fetus never drew a single breath outside the body of the mother. And remember all the opinions that this fetus could not have been viable. Think about what the hard evidence is here. I suggest that unless you find that Dr. Edelin was some kind of ogre out to terminate the existence of babies, you will find that he was without question performing a medical task which, in his best judgment, was sanctioned not only by medicine, but by the law, and that you will find him not guilty. Thank you.
Mr. Flanagan?
Please, the court. Mr. Foreman, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Now, from the beginning, there's been a lot of talk about clocks here. And why do they keep harping on the clock? Let me tell you why. It's a side thing to take your eyes off the issues in this case. And remember, the issue here is not whether a woman has the right to abort. We agree. We may not like it, but that's the law. This is not the case of Dr. Mecklenburg versus Kenneth Edelin. This is not the case of Dr. Jimenez versus Kenneth Edelin. This is not the case of anti-abortion or pro. It involves the killing, unjustifiably, of an independent human being following an abortion, not during the termination of a pregnancy. You remember the testimony of Dr. Mecklenburg? The procedure you take in a hysterotomy for abortion, you open her up, you take the fetus out, you hand it to the pediatrician, then you go back for the placenta. Dr. Ward comes up here and tells you in his medical opinion this baby breathed outside of the uterus. Now, the defendant tells you that he took out a fetus, a subject. Well, take a look at the picture of the subject. Is this just a subject? Is this just a specimen? You tell us what it is. Look at the picture. Show it to anybody. What would they tell you it was? Use your common sense when you go to your jury deliberation room and humanize that. Are we talking about a blob here or a big bunch of mucus? What are we talking about? Subjects? I respectfully submit we're talking about an independent human being that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts must protect, as well as anybody in this courtroom, including the defendant. Now, when you go to your jury deliberation room, you be fair to the defendant, but be fair to the Commonwealth. The fact that the defendant happens to be a doctor, well, that shouldn't be to his advantage nor to his detriment. And you can't use sympathy in this case because, obviously, what's the most sympathetic thing in the whole case? The first thing that you must try and sift through and realize is the facts. What actually took place here? And I respectfully submit that on all the evidence you find, you'd be more than warranted in finding this defendant guilty of the crime with which he is charged. It's not an easy thing to do, to come in here and call them apart from sympathy, but it's a necessary thing. Remember, there's no greater right in our society than the right to live, and there's no more heinous thing than to deprive an individual of that right to life. And whether it's the backstreet killing, or the white collar killing, or the white coat killing, you must make that determination. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the process of finding facts is a search for truth. That is the meaning of the word verdict. You must act fairly, you must apply reason, and you must not let yourselves be influenced by considerations of bias or prejudice or sympathy or emotion. After I give you these instructions on the rules of law, you are required to follow them. It's not open to you to make your own law. It's not open to you to question the law or to decide that it ought to be different. You take the law as I give it to you. This is an onerous responsibility. Here you are asked to make a finding in a most sensitive area of human relations, and you must apply the law as I have given it to you, to those facts you find. This has been a long trial, and you will take whatever time you think you need in your deliberations. I wish particularly to thank you for your attention throughout the entire proceedings.
All rise.
After 6 weeks of evidence and argument, the jury retired. It took them 2 days to reach their verdict.
And the defendant rise, please. Members of the jury, have you agreed upon your verdict?
We have, sir.
What say you, Mr. Foreman, on indictment number 81823, charging the defendant, Kenneth Edelin, with manslaughter?
The defendant is guilty.
Edelin could have been sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. Instead, Judge Maguire gave him a year's probation.
Lots of people have tried to make me a hero or martyr. I think the real heroes and I think the real martyrs are those women who before January 22nd, 1973, had to put their lives on the line. I did nothing which was illegal, immoral, or bad medical practice. Everything I did was in accordance with the law and with good medical practice.
What do you think happened there?
Well, I think the jury was really not a jury of Edelin's peers. They were all white, mostly Catholic.
Probably Catholic.
I don't think they understood the medical facts of the case. What would you say, June?
Well, I think that their emotions ruled the day. The judge's charges really were not listened to, and I think the judge himself might have been quite surprised by the fact the jury came in with a guilty verdict.
Edelin appealed against his conviction. It'll be heard in a few weeks' time in April. Today, Edelin is still at Boston City Hospital. He's still practicing medicine, still performing abortions when necessary. But the effects of the trial have been widespread. Doctors in America are now more cautious about carrying out abortions, especially late-term abortions beyond 20 weeks. And all over the country, it's been the poorest women who've suffered most. The women who, through fear, ignorance, and delays in the hospital system, are not seen until it's too late. The trial settled none of the important questions, although it raised many new ones. Are criminal proceedings the proper way to decide this kind of issue? Is it fair to ask a jury of ordinary people to sort their way through such complex scientific evidence? Answers will have to be found to all the questions raised by the Edelin affair if the abortion debate is ever to be resolved.